my name is Louise. I'm 67 years old, and the night I screamed in front of my entire family wasn't the night I was betrayed. It was the night I realized the betrayal had been happening for years, right under my nose, while I smiled and set the dinner table for people who never planned to let me stay. Sometimes it doesn't take a dramatic confrontation to break a woman down. Sometimes all it takes is silence from the man you trusted, and a quiet little box from the only person who still saw you as worth protecting. That night, everything I thought I knew about love, family, and loyalty fell apart across a polished dining table, and by the end of dessert, I wasn't the one being ignored anymore. They were. It had started like any other carefully curated evening, one of those family dinners where the warmth in the room was more about presentation than connection. My daughter-in-law, Danielle, had just moved into her dream home, and the occasion called for celebration, though it was clear from the start that the invitation extended to me was more of a polite formality than a genuine welcome. Her new house gleamed in all the ways mine never could, all sleek lines, white marble, and expensive silence. I could already feel the calculation behind every perfectly set fork and lit candle. They didn't want me there, not really, but they wanted to be seen inviting me. Robert, my husband, trailed behind me as we entered, greeting our son with the kind of warmth I hadn't felt from him in years. I smiled too, holding my coat awkwardly until someone gestured to take it. I shouldn't have been surprised when no one looked me in the eye for more than a second. Danielle's family filled the room, her sister with her loud laugh and louder diamonds, her brother-in-law scrolling through his phone like the rest of us were background noise. I took my seat at the far end of the table, trying to tell myself that I was imagining things, that it was just a long day and not something deeper, not a sign. But as the evening went on, I felt it grow around me like a thick fog, the way everyone seemed to speak over me, around me, never to me. I was present, yes, but not included, like a framed photo on the wall they didn't want to take down, but didn't want to notice either. And then came the gifts. Boxes wrapped in gold foil were passed around with cheerful delight. Laptops for the nephews, envelopes of cash for Danielle's sisters, vacation vouchers tucked into greeting cards with the kind of ease that only comes when generosity is really a performance. Everyone clapped and gasped, everyone except me, because I didn't get one. I didn't expect a laptop or money. I wasn't there to collect anything but a moment of kindness, a gesture that said I still mattered. But when Danielle looked at me, then turned to her sister and said with a casual shrug and a smirk, "Well, Louise isn't really family," something inside me cracked. And when the room didn't go silent, when no one gasped or objected or stood up for me, it shattered completely. I turned slowly to Robert, hoping to find at least a flicker of protest on his face. But he was busy buttering his roll like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just watched his wife be erased. I excused myself, barely holding myself together as I walked into the kitchen, blinking back the sting in my eyes. I stood by the window, watching the wind rattle the patio furniture outside, and tried to remember the last time I had felt wanted by any of them. I had raised my son with every ounce of love I had. I had accepted Danielle into our lives when she came along, helped her, comforted her, made her feel welcome when she was pregnant and scared and alone. I had given them time, money, attention, but now apparently I was no longer family. And then I heard the quiet shuffle of small footsteps. I turned and saw Matthew, my 7-year-old grandson, standing there in his little red sweater, holding a box in both hands. It was wooden, plain, and slightly worn, something that looked like it had been made to protect something private. His eyes were wide and serious. "Grandma," he said softly, "Dad told me to give this to you, if you ever ignored me again." At first, I didn't understand. My breath caught. I hadn't ignored him, not on purpose, not ever. But something about the way he looked at me, so hopeful and scared at the same time, made my heart drop. He slid the box across the counter slowly, carefully, like it might explode if handled wrong. I looked at it, then at him. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid, and what I saw inside made me scream. The scream that left my mouth wasn't loud in the traditional sense. It wasn't some wild shriek or hysterical wail that made people rush into the kitchen with fear in their eyes. It was quieter, sharper, the kind that slices through a room like broken glass under bare feet, the kind of sound that turns heads and tightens jaws because everyone knows something just cracked that can't be glued back together. And in the seconds after it escaped my lips, the box still open in my hands, no one moved. Not Robert, not Danielle, not her too-polished sister, or any of the well-fed guests sitting around that beautiful table. Only Matthew, my grandson, stood still beside me with his little hands clasped in front of him, watching my face with such quiet knowing that it nearly undid me. Inside that box was a folded piece of paper and a small plastic keychain, the kind you get made at cheap mall kiosks with a photo sealed inside, the kind you never think will mean anything until you realize it's the only thing someone thought to leave behind. The photo was old, clearly taken years ago, faded slightly from wear. It was of me, holding baby Matthew in my lap, his tiny hand gripping my finger while I laughed at something off camera, my face open and unguarded in a way I hadn't been in years. It wasn't a special event, not a birthday or a holiday. It was just us, at home, real. And suddenly the photo meant more than anything I'd seen that night, more than all the gifts or glittering wine glasses or stage smiles. It was a memory of a time when I was still seen, still needed, still loved. But the paper, that was something else entirely. It was a letter, handwritten, not by a child, not by Matthew, but by my son, my only son. His handwriting hit me like a cold wind, familiar, rushed, slightly messy, but unmistakably his. And as I read it, standing frozen in that too bright kitchen with my ears ringing and my heart sinking, I realized the box hadn't just come from Matthew. It had come from beyond him. It had come from the one person who had once sworn to protect me, and who must have known somehow that the people he left me with would one day try to erase me from their story. The letter was short, simple, but it said more than any gift at that table ever could. He wrote that if I ever found myself being pushed aside, if anyone ever treated me like I didn't matter anymore, I needed to show them this letter and remember what was real. He said that families forget sometimes, especially when there's money and pride and new relationships clouding their hearts. He said that Matthew was my shadow, my living proof that I was more than just convenient. I was the reason he had grown up feeling safe, the reason he had known what love looked like. He said that if Matthew gave me the box, it meant things had gone too far, and that I needed to act, not for revenge, not even for justice, but to remind them who I was, because if I didn't, they'd rewrite history without me in it. When I looked up, my hands trembling, the letter still clutched between my fingers, the room had gone silent. Danielle had entered the kitchen with her arms folded, trying to look calm but unable to mask the tightness in her jaw. Robert stood behind her, finally looking at me, though his expression was unreadable, a mixture of guilt and confusion, like he knew something had just shifted but hadn't figured out if it was going to cost him yet. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I gently placed the keychain back into the box, folded the letter, and closed the lid with care, not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I needed them to see that I was no longer shaking. I turned to Matthew, reached for his little hand, and gave it a soft squeeze. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just nodded, like he understood that something important had happened, and that I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. And then I walked back to the table, back into the center of the room where moments earlier I had been nothing more than a forgotten chair filler, and placed the box right in front of Danielle's untouched plate. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I simply looked her in the eye for the first time in years and saw something flicker there. Not anger, not smugness, but something new. Fear. I don't remember how the dinner ended. I know I left before dessert. I know Robert didn't follow me. I know no one tried to stop me. But when I stepped outside into the cold night air, clutching the box to my chest like a lifeline, I finally felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but clarity. Because now I knew the truth. They hadn't forgotten me by accident. They had erased me on purpose. And they were about to learn what happens when the woman they tried to erase decides she's not finished writing her story. The box sat untouched on the table for days after that dinner, like something radioactive no one dared to get close to, and I didn't open it again, not because I was afraid of what was inside, I already knew what it held, but because I needed to let the weight of it settle in their minds the same way it had settled in mine. I left their house that night with my coat buttoned to the neck and the sharp sound of silence clinging to my back. Not a word from Robert, not a glance from Danielle, just the echo of Matthew's tiny fingers slipping from mine at the door and the knowledge that something irreversible had begun the moment I screamed. Back home, I laid the box on my kitchen table like it was made of glass and sat across from it as the house filled with memories I hadn't let surface in years. Sunday mornings with my son as a boy, his small hands tugging at my apron while I stirred pancake batter. The way he used to run into my arms when he got home from school, even into his teenage years. The pride in his voice when he introduced me to Danielle for the first time. Before things shifted, before I became a relic of their past. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had looked at me like I mattered until Matthew did, with his little voice and his brave decision to slide that box toward me, knowing somehow that it carried a kind of truth the adults in his life wanted to bury. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade, a woman named Carla, an old friend from church who had become a notary public and part-time legal assistant after retiring early from her job in the county clerk's office. She'd always had a head for details and a low tolerance for injustice, and I knew if there was anyone who could help me understand the letter, the signatures, the weight behind those words, it was her. She came by with coffee and a skeptical brow, but after I handed her the letter and she read it silently at my kitchen table, her face slowly changed. She sat back in the chair, blinking in surprise, and asked me if I was ready to make this official. Carla explained that what I had, the original letter from my son, along with a few other financial documents that had apparently been folded beneath the note and which I hadn't even realized were in the envelope, could become the basis of a legal case if I wanted it. It wasn't just a letter of affection or a vague warning. It was written in my son's own hand and mentioned changes made to financial agreements, property ownership, and family trust arrangements that I had never been informed of. If those changes had gone through without proper authorization, especially after his passing, there might be real consequences for those who had benefited, particularly if it could be shown that someone had deliberately hidden or manipulated those documents. I listened to Carla's voice as if from underwater, everything echoing in my mind, because I hadn't been expecting this to turn into something that big. I thought maybe it would give me closure, or at least enough strength to walk away with my head high. But now it seemed like the truth in that box had more weight than I ever imagined. And the moment she asked whether I wanted to pursue it, something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, stirred awake. I wasn't angry for myself, not in the usual way. I was angry for all the years I had let them chip away at me, politely accepting their distance, their coldness, their growing disdain, just to keep the peace. I was tired of peace. I wanted truth, and I wanted them to feel, for once, what it was like to be powerless in a story they didn't get to control. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of stillness, filled with quiet steps and louder thoughts. I didn't return their calls, not that there were many. Robert sent one message that was vague and half-hearted, more a formality than a real attempt to mend anything. Danielle said nothing. I could only imagine the whispers that passed around their dining table now, the tension whenever someone mentioned my name. I wondered if the box still sat where I'd left it that night, or if Danielle had already locked it away, trying to forget the look on my face when I opened it. But the damage was done. Not to me, to the illusion they'd built around themselves, because now I had proof that I mattered, and more than that, I had a plan. With Carla's help, I made copies of the documents and submitted a formal inquiry into the trust my son had set up. It turned out there were irregularities, small ones maybe, but enough to raise questions. Funds that had been moved, property titles that had changed hands under Robert's name after my son passed, with no clear paper trail or required notification to me, despite the fact that I had once been listed as co-owner on the house we'd all lived in together. Somewhere along the way, Danielle and Robert had rewritten the lines of that ownership, gradually edging me out, quietly selling off assets, shifting accounts, until I was left with nothing but the occasional visit and a seat at the far end of their dinner table, too far away to notice what they had taken, until now. What they didn't count on was that I wasn't alone anymore. Not truly, because Matthew had changed everything. That small boy, in his innocence, had unknowingly brought the truth back to life, and now I was holding it in my hands like a flame I refused to let go. I had been erased slowly, carefully, but not completely, and now that I had been given the chance to draw a line in the sand, I was going to make sure they saw it and remembered that I was still standing behind it, stronger than they expected, and more determined than ever not to disappear. I hadn't expected to find myself back inside that house so soon, not after what happened the night of the dinner, not after the box and the letter and everything that followed. But sometimes the truth has a way of pulling you back toward the very place that tried to break you, if only so you can walk through it one last time. Not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as someone who finally has something solid to stand on. It was Carla's suggestion, actually, that I return to the house to gather a few personal items I had left behind, keepsakes from my son that I never collected after his passing. Small things like a leather-bound journal in his handwriting, a family photo tucked into the bookshelf, or the ceramic angel figurine he made for me in 5th grade, and which Danielle had refused to return by mail, claiming it was too fragile to ship, though deep down I think she just didn't want me to have it. I arrived on a Monday afternoon, the sky heavy with winter clouds, and the air thick with that kind of silence that makes every sound feel louder. And as I stood on their porch with my coat zipped tight and the copy of Carla's legal note in my bag, a respectful but firm request for access to my personal effects, I felt my hands begin to shake, not from fear exactly, but from the build-up of years of quiet hurt, of moments swallowed and words bitten back, all of it gathering now in my chest, like a storm I had no more room to hold. Danielle answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that said she was only tolerating this because someone made her, and she led me into the front room without a word, her heels clicking across the tile like a countdown. I moved quickly, not wanting to linger, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of thinking I missed anything about this place, and I gathered what I needed: the angel, the journal, a few photos that had been left in a side drawer, while trying not to let my eyes fall on the expensive new things that now filled every inch of the home I once helped pay for. Robert wasn't home, which didn't surprise me, and Matthew was upstairs, though Danielle made it clear she didn't want him disturbed, claiming he was resting, though I wondered if maybe he just didn't want to see the adults fighting again. It was when I was reaching for the last photo frame on the hallway shelf that I heard it, a sudden, high-pitched yelp from the second floor, the kind of sound a child makes when they're frightened, but trying not to cry out fully, and my body responded before my mind could catch up. I dropped everything I was holding and rushed toward the stairs, calling Matthew's name before I even made it to the landing, my heart pounding as the worst-case scenarios flashed through my mind in blinding succession. A fall, an accident, something deliberate. Danielle shouted something behind me, her voice sharp, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop, because the only thing I could think was that I had already lost one child in this house, and I couldn't lose another. Not now. Not while I was finally starting to fight for myself again. I threw open the door to his room so hard it bounced off the wall, and what I saw nearly made my knees buckle. Matthew was curled up on the carpet in the corner, holding his hands over his ears, tears running down his cheeks, but otherwise unharmed. Beside him, his tablet lay face down, the screen still lit, and I saw at once that he hadn't fallen. He had heard something bad, something loud. I crouched beside him, gently brushing his hair back from his forehead, whispering that he was safe, that I was here, and he clung to me like a life raft, his little body trembling against mine. It was only later, after I had calmed him down, after Danielle had stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her expression unreadable, that he told me what had scared him. He had overheard a conversation, Danielle on the phone with someone, her voice raised, her words fast and sharp, talking about lawyers and money and how they were going to handle it before she ruins everything. He wasn't sure who she was, but he was smart enough to guess, and it had frightened him, not because he thought they would hurt me, but because he realized, maybe for the first time, that the people he lived with were willing to pretend I didn't exist, even if it meant lying to him. I held him close until his breathing slowed, and then I promised him, quietly, so Danielle wouldn't hear, that no one was going to erase me, and no one was going to silence him, not while I was still standing. I left that house without looking back, but this time I didn't feel broken. I felt lit from within, fueled by something bigger than anger, because now it wasn't just about me, it was about the child who still believed in right and wrong. It was about protecting his innocence from the kind of coldness that had tried to shrink me down all these years. And if Danielle and Robert wanted a fight, then I was ready, because I had truth, memory, and a little boy with a heart too big to forget what love feels like. In the days that followed, something shifted inside me. Not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic wave of anger or vengeance, but a slow, steady settling of my bones into the realization that I had been waiting my whole life for someone else to give me permission to stand up for myself, and that now, finally, I was done waiting. The weight of that small box, of the letter, of Matthew's tearful eyes and trembling arms around my neck, stayed with me like a second heartbeat, pulsing behind every breath I took, reminding me that this wasn't just about proving a point or taking something back. It was about honoring every version of myself I had silenced over the years for the sake of harmony that only ever worked one way. Carla helped me put together everything we needed: copies of the documents, dated financial records, photos of the angel figurine and family heirlooms that had been quietly redistributed without my consent, and most importantly, the handwritten letter from my son, which mentioned my original place in the family trust and expressed, in undeniable terms, his wish that I be protected and remembered. It turned out, after a careful legal review, that several changes had been made to the trust documents within months of his passing, all of them reducing or eliminating my position in the inheritance plan, and while the paperwork had been filed in a way that looked clean on the surface, small discrepancies in signatures, dates, and missing notifications began to cast long shadows. We didn't go public. I didn't want drama, not the kind that stains names in the press or turns families into headlines. I wanted clarity. I wanted quiet, firm justice, the kind that starts in private and ends in peace. Carla filed a formal inquiry with the county records office, requesting a review of the changes made to the trust, and within a week we received confirmation that the revisions would be temporarily frozen until all parties were consulted. That meant Robert and Danielle were legally required to sit down for mediation, and when that letter landed on their doorstep, it was no longer me they could ignore. I hadn't seen Robert since the day I visited their house. He hadn't called, hadn't sent a message, not even a polite gesture to check on Matthew after his panic. So when he finally arrived for the meeting, gray suit, nervous hands, eyes that didn't quite know where to land, I barely recognized the man who had once held our newborn son with tears in his eyes. Danielle came too, dressed in a muted blouse that didn't suit her usual style, her face pale and jaw tight, like someone who realized the mirror had turned toward her too late. They were seated across from me in a small conference room, carpeted in beige, a stack of printed folders resting between us, like a line neither of us dared to cross. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make accusations. I simply spoke, slowly, clearly, calmly, about the years I had spent loving a family that saw me as disposable, about the pain of being erased piece by piece, not in one cruel moment, but in 100 tiny gestures that no one else noticed until the box appeared and exposed the cracks they'd tried to hide. I spoke about Matthew, about his fear, about how a child, had been the one to protect the truth when the adults around him were too busy rewriting it. And when I was done, I reached into my bag and laid the original letter on the table without a word. They didn't touch it. Not right away. Danielle shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the paper as if it might catch fire. Robert looked down at his hands, then finally, lifted his eyes to meet mine. And I saw it then, not guilt, not yet, but the first flicker of recognition, like someone waking up in the middle of their own dream and realizing the story wasn't theirs alone. He nodded once. That was all. Just a nod. But it was more than I'd gotten from him in years. The outcome wasn't dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no shouting matches, no courtroom scenes. There was paperwork, carefully reviewed and revised. There were funds returned and titles re-examined. I wasn't handed a fortune, and I didn't ask for one. I got back the house my son and I had once co-owned, small and a little worn, but mine again. And in the end, that was enough. Because when Matthew stepped inside that house for the first time and saw the old photos on the walls, the familiar furniture, the angel figurine on the mantel, he smiled the way children smile when something finally feels safe. He stayed with me that first weekend, curled beside me on the couch with a blanket over our knees and popcorn between us, watching an old cartoon he loved. He didn't ask about his mom. He didn't ask about Robert. He just leaned his head against my shoulder and whispered that he was glad I wasn't gone. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't taking anything back. It's reclaiming the space they thought they'd cleared. It's sitting in your own chair, in your own house, with your own name still stitched into the lives that matter, and knowing they can't unwrite you no matter how hard they tried. I thought the hardest part was behind me, that after the mediation, the corrections, the quiet return of what was mine, life would settle into something gentler, something whole again. But as it so often goes, the moment you let yourself believe you're safe is the moment you realize the story isn't quite finished. It was a Tuesday morning, soft rain streaking the windows, the kind of gray day that makes everything inside feel warmer by contrast. And I had just set a tray of cinnamon rolls on the table for Matthew when the doorbell rang. I expected the mailman, maybe Carla, with more paperwork. But when I opened the door, I found a woman I'd never seen before, mid-30s, professional, cautious smile, and a clipboard in her hands. She introduced herself not as a neighbor, not as a lawyer, but as a child welfare investigator. For a moment I couldn't breathe, not because I thought I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew instantly who had sent her. She asked if we could speak privately. Matthew was in the living room, distracted by cartoons, and I led her into the kitchen, where the warmth of cinnamon and coffee suddenly felt meaningless. She explained that a report had been filed anonymously, claiming concern for Matthew's emotional well-being, specifically citing sudden changes in living arrangements and potential manipulation involving a minor in a family dispute. It was worded carefully, but the implication was clear. Someone was accusing me of using my grandson to influence a legal outcome, of turning him against his parents. I felt the floor tilt under my feet. I had fought with everything I had, quietly, carefully, to do this the right way, to protect Matthew without ever dragging him into the ugliness, and now they were trying to rip him away from me with the very truth he had helped protect. I answered the investigator's questions calmly, clearly, with every document ready and every moment accounted for. She examined the letter, the notarized statements, the photographs of my home, clean, safe, filled with signs of a child's comfort, not distress. Still, her eyes were trained in neutrality. She didn't show judgment, but she didn't offer comfort either. She said a case would be opened, that home visits would be scheduled, that interviews would be conducted, and that until further notice, Matthew would need to return to his mother's residence. The sound of his name leaving her mouth in that context nearly broke me. I packed his overnight bag slowly, each item folded with trembling hands, every small sock and soft t-shirt feeling like a goodbye I wasn't ready to give. He didn't cry. He looked confused, then quietly upset. But when I crouched down and told him it would only be for a few days, he nodded and tried to smile the way brave little boys do when they think grown-ups need them to. He hugged me tightly, whispered that he'd miss me, and then took the investigator's hand and followed her to the car. The house was unbearably quiet after that, For the first time since the box, I felt defeated, not because I was afraid of losing a legal case, but because I knew I was up against something colder than the courts. Danielle had no intention of letting go. She hadn't learned. She hadn't broken. She was still fighting the only way she knew how, by cutting out anything that threatened her version of control. But she forgot something. She forgot that while she had been busy building walls, I had been planting seeds, quiet ones, small ones, in Matthew's heart, in the people around me, in the very legal system she tried to manipulate. Because while she thought the letter had been my only protection, she hadn't counted on the fact that Matthew had been recording. Not because I asked him to, not for court, not even on purpose, but that night, the one where he heard Danielle on the phone, yelling, strategizing, he had his tablet in his hands, and the audio had saved. Carla found it a week later while helping me organize files on the cloud drive I didn't fully understand how to use. She played it once, then twice, and then sat back in her chair with her hand over her mouth. Danielle's voice was unmistakable, clear, cruel, furious, talking about how Matthew was too attached to me, how they would fix that, how if necessary, they would use the system to shake her up a little. Her words hung in the air like smoke, and now, finally, I had more than a memory. I had evidence. The reversal came fast after that. The caseworker reviewed the audio, spoke with the county attorney, and within days, the investigation turned. Not only was I cleared of any wrongdoing, but the original complaint was flagged for malicious intent. Danielle was issued a formal warning, and Robert, who had remained disturbingly quiet through all of it, was advised to seek independent counsel regarding custody. But the most unexpected turn of all came from Matthew himself. During his interview with the child specialist, he calmly told them that he wanted to live with me, that he felt safer in my home, that he had never once been asked to lie, only to tell the truth when it mattered. And when the court reviewed the full context, they agreed to grant me temporary guardianship with full visitation rights. It wasn't forever, but it was enough to keep him close, enough to give him peace, enough to finally draw the line Danielle couldn't cross anymore. Weeks later, I stood in my kitchen again, same cinnamon rolls on the table, same quiet afternoon light. Only now Matthew sat across from me, barefoot, laughing at a joke he made about the cat knocking over my plant. The house was warm, whole, ours. And as I watched him smile, really smile, I realized something important. You can take away money, houses, titles, reputations. You can even try to take people's memories. But you can't erase the one thing I kept: love. Honest, persistent, inconvenient love. The kind that leaves a mark deeper than any signature. The kind that even betrayal can't rewrite. So here's my question for you, if you've stayed with me this far. Have you ever been pushed out of a life you helped build, treated like you no longer mattered, only to find that someone, somewhere, still remembered you the way you once were? And if you have, what did you do next? Because sometimes the quietest revenge isn't fire. It's staying.